Senator Mitchell, please.
Thank you, Professor, Mr. Lowy, distinguished guests, members of the Institute. It's an honor for me to be with you today to discuss the subject of this conference, the U.S.-Israeli alliance under new administrations. As we all know, on January 20th, the United States will have a new president. 3 weeks later, Israel will elect a new Knesset and begin the process of forming a government. Whatever the administrations, the U.S.-Israeli relationship will remain strong. As President-elect Obama said recently, our alliance is based on shared interests and shared values. Those who threaten Israel threaten us. I will bring to the White House an unshakable commitment to Israel's security. This, of course, reaffirmed many similar statements by his predecessors. A strong relationship has always been America's objective and policy. As he takes office, Obama confronts very serious problems at home. The United States currently faces its worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Unemployment is surging, home prices have fallen sharply, and the federal budget deficit this fiscal year will be the largest ever by far. But even as he deals with these problems, he will have to confront several difficult foreign policy issues. In this region, as he has made clear, he will give high priority to a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. He also will have to manage the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq, an increase in our focus on Afghanistan, including higher force levels there, Iran's continuing ambitions in this region, including its drive to acquire nuclear weapons, continuing tensions between India and Pakistan, and the ongoing threat of terrorism against the United States, its citizens, and its allies. Of course, Israel has its own concerns. Among them are that the president of Iran continues to threaten Israel's existence, Hamas controls Gaza and continues both its rocket attacks and its refusal to recognize Israel's right to exist. Hezbollah has rearmed with weapons supplied by Iran and Syria. And there is growing pessimism among Israelis and Palestinians that a peace agreement can be reached in the near future. As our two countries confront these challenges, in a region filled with both peril and opportunity, it's essential that our President and your Prime Minister have a relationship of trust and confidence. Matters of tactics and timing are often subjects of disagreement, debate, of give and take between sovereign countries. This is inevitable, understandable, and should trouble no one. But on the major issues, including a comprehensive and sustainable peace between Israel and its neighbors, and turning Iran away from nuclear weapons, it's important that our leaders work together and agree on objectives and strategy. Much has happened in this region since I chaired the Sharm el-Sheikh Fact-Finding Committee in 2001. 7 years, or even 60 years, is a long time. But consider Northern Ireland, where last year the ancient conflict known as the Troubles ended when longtime enemies came together to form a power-sharing government. This was almost 800 years after Britain began its domination of Ireland, 86 years after the partition of Ireland, 38 years after the British Army formally began its most recent mission in Ireland, 11 years after the peace talks began, and 9 years after the peace agreement was signed. In the negotiations which led up to that agreement, we had 700 days of failure and 1 day of success. I spent 5 years going to, coming from, and working in Northern Ireland, during which I chaired 3 separate sets of negotiations. For that, almost all of that time, progress was very slow or mostly non-existent. So, for those of you in the Middle East who are discouraged, I understand your feelings. But from my experience in Northern Ireland, I formed the conviction that there is no such thing as a conflict that can't be ended. Conflicts are created and conducted by human beings. They can be ended by human beings. I saw it happen in Northern Ireland, although admittedly it took a very long time. I believe deeply that with committed, persevering, and active diplomacy, it can happen in the Middle East. It's been nearly a decade since the effective end of the Oslo process. Thousands have died. Israel's economy, despite impressive growth, is nevertheless not as strong as it would be without this conflict. The Palestinian economy has been very severely damaged. There are, of course, many, many reasons to be doubtful, even skeptical about the possibility of an agreement here. But the pursuit of peace is so important that it demands our continued effort, no matter what the difficulties or the setbacks. One key is the mutual commitment of the parties and the active participation of the United States government and the many other governments and institutions who want to help. Much is required of leaders who wish to achieve the goal of 2 democratic, independent states living in peace. They must first reconcile the fact that the circumstances and the objectives of the 2 sides are different. Israel has a state, but its people live in unbearable anxiety. So security for the people is an overriding objective. The Palestinians don't have a state, and they want one, an independent, economically viable, and geographically contiguous state. That is their overriding objective. I believe that neither can attain its objective by denying to the other side its objectives. Israelis are not likely to have sustainable security if the Palestinians don't have a state, and Palestinians will never achieve a state until the people of Israel have some security. So with each launched missile or suicide bomb attack, the prospect of a Palestinian state is delayed, not advanced. But there must be available to Palestinians the clear alternative, an alternative which they must seize, of a nonviolent path to a Palestinian state living in peace alongside a Jewish state. Palestinians, in turn, must accept that the Israeli demand for security is as real and as necessary as is their demand for a state. Of course, this has been and remains American policy. President Bush reiterated that earlier this year in Jerusalem when he said, and I quote, "The point of departure for permanent status negotiations to realize this vision seems clear. There should be an end to the occupation that began in 1967. The agreement must establish Palestine as a homeland for the Palestinian people, just as Israel is a homeland for the Jewish people. These negotiations must ensure that Israel has secure, recognized, and defensible borders. And they must ensure that the state of Palestine is viable, contiguous, sovereign, and independent. It is vital that each side understands that satisfying the other's fundamental objectives is key to a successful agreement. Security for Israel and viability for the Palestinian state are in the mutual interest of both parties." Unfortunately, the positive attitudes so carefully nurtured during the previous decade appear to have largely dissipated, replaced by a growing sense of futility, of despair, of the inevitability of conflict. Hamas's electoral victory and its takeover of Gaza create political instability and increasing anxiety. Here in Israel, there is political uncertainty as you look toward elections and a new government. President-elect Obama also said recently that he intends to make progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a key diplomatic priority. He went on to say that his administration will make a sustained push, working with Israelis and Palestinians to achieve the goal of two states, a Jewish state in Israel and a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security. I believe that this effort must be determined and persevering, backed up by political capital, economic resources, and focused attention at the highest levels of government. This does not mean that it should be an American process or an American agreement. To the contrary, it must be firmly rooted in a shared vision of the people who live here for a peaceful future. But experience has shown that firm, constant, and creative U.S. diplomacy can be helpful. No two countries, no two conflicts are the same. So what happened in Northern Ireland cannot be precisely replicated here or anywhere else. But it does offer an example of what can happen when peace makes a better life possible. I know that cynicism and fear are on the rise and that it will be very difficult to overcome the obstacles that are many and large. There's much history here to overcome. But there also was a lot of history in Northern Ireland. There, decades of bitter, brutal sectarian warfare had created public attitudes that were deeply negative and filled with despair. Just 4 days before the agreement was reached, a public opinion poll reported that 83% of the public believed that no agreement was possible. Only 7% thought it possible, 10% had no opinion. But 4 days later, we did get an agreement, and it is held. Competing claims, religious differences, and many other factors have led to a grinding, demoralizing, and destructive conflict here. The two sides can continue in conflict indefinitely, or they can find a way to live side by side in peace and with stability. I believe with all my heart and soul that it can be done, that it must be done, for the alternative is unacceptable and should be unthinkable. Thanks for inviting me here to join with you. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.